I invited my family for dinner. They evicted me from my own house. It was supposed to be a celebration. I had just landed the biggest promotion of my career, and I wanted to share the moment with the people who raised me. So I cleaned the house from top to bottom, cooked my parents' favorite meal, opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving, and lit candles like it was Thanksgiving. They smiled, they laughed, they even complimented my mashed potatoes. Then, somewhere between dessert and coffee, my father put down his fork, looked me in the eye, and said calmly, "You'll need to leave the keys. This house belongs to the family now." I laughed until I realized no one else was. I should have asked questions. I should have slammed the table. I should have screamed. Instead, I handed him my keys and walked out of the home I worked 10 years to afford. It wasn't until the mortgage company called the next morning that I understood what they were really after. My parents weren't always like this. There was a time, long before lawyers and locks, when the Monroe family meant pancakes on Sunday mornings, dad jokes that made us groan, and family road trips in a beat-up minivan that smelled like sunscreen and fast food fries. I grew up believing I was lucky. Not rich, not glamorous, but surrounded by love. At least that's what I told myself. My mom was the kind of woman who labeled everything with a Sharpie. School supplies, spice jars, even her Tupperware. She made photo albums for every year of my childhood. My dad worked long hours at the local utility company, but still managed to help me build science fair volcanoes and show up for every swim meet, even if he cheered too loudly. I was their firstborn, their golden girl, and I played the role perfectly. Honor roll, polite, responsible. I never missed curfew and never pushed boundaries. "You're our rock," Mom would say, especially when Ethan started acting out. "We don't worry about you." At the time, I thought that was love. Now I wonder if it was a setup. They made sacrifices, that part is true. When I got pneumonia in 7th grade, Mom quit her part-time job to take care of me. Dad took on extra shifts so I could have braces. When I got my first car, a dented but reliable Honda Civic, they split the down payment. I was grateful, so grateful. But gratitude has a strange way of turning into debt when love comes with strings. After high school, I got into a university across the country with a full scholarship for finance. "But they didn't want me to go. What if something happens?" Mom said. "Springfield Community College is good enough. You don't need to run away to be successful." So I stayed. Even when my gut screamed at me to go, I stayed. For them. I commuted from home, studied late, worked part-time jobs, and built a resume piece by piece. I sent them my schedule every semester. I told them about every job interview, every internship, every worry. I thought I was being respectful. What I was doing was reporting in like a child, not a woman. When I landed my first full-time job as a junior financial analyst, they cried. We went out to Olive Garden to celebrate. Dad raised his glass and said, "To our Avery, everything we've poured into her is paying off." I didn't notice then that it wasn't about my hard work, it was theirs. I bought groceries for them when Mom had surgery and couldn't cook. I gave Ethan a loan when his car broke down, a loan he never brought up again. I helped them set up online banking, manage their budget, and explained every IRS letter they got in the mail. It felt natural. I was just doing what good daughters do, right? When I moved into my own apartment, a tiny one-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood, they visited often, too often. Mom would rearrange my pantry to make it more functional. Dad would point out security weaknesses in my locks. I told myself they were being helpful. Looking back now, I realize they never saw it as mine. Ethan never left home. He lived in their garage apartment, paid no rent, and treated their house like a hotel, but he was their baby. "You're the strong one, Avery," Mom would say whenever I expressed concern. "He just needs more time." I kept believing that. I kept being strong. I kept showing up. The day I bought my house, I cried alone in the hallway after the realtor handed me the keys. It wasn't sadness. It was the overwhelming joy of finally having something that was mine. My space, my rules. I texted my parents a photo. We did it, I wrote. Mom replied with a thumbs up emoji. Dad said, call when you settle in. I told myself they were just busy. I didn't let it ruin the moment. But a small voice inside whispered, they're not proud. They're uncomfortable. I ignored that voice. Because when you spend your whole life convincing yourself you're loved, you'll do anything to protect that version of the story, even when it starts to break. At first, the signs were easy to miss. A few odd questions here, a comment there, nothing that screamed betrayal, just tiny things that made me pause, then dismiss. It started when my dad casually asked, so what bank's holding your mortgage? We were sitting on the back porch of their house, watching Ethan install a new gutter system he was getting paid for under the table. I didn't think anything of it. Dad had always liked to know details. He was a just curious kind of guy. I told him the name of the bank. He nodded like he was cataloging the information. Fixed or adjustable rate, he added. Fixed, I said. 30-year, locked it in low when the market dipped. Smart, he muttered. But there was something else in his voice. Something that felt less like approval and more like calculation. Then Mom started dropping hints about storage. Our attic's getting so musty, she told me one weekend. Could we maybe store some of the family keepsakes at your place, just temporarily? She showed up a few days later with boxes of photo albums and my grandmother's wedding china. You know, this house has always felt like a second home to us, she said as she placed them neatly on the top shelf of my hall closet. A second home? My home? I laughed it off, but it lodged somewhere uncomfortable. They wanted copies of my spare keys, just in case. I'd given them one when I first moved in, mostly out of habit. They were my emergency contact, after all. When I considered changing the locks months later, after a weird moment when I came home and found Mom folding laundry I hadn't asked her to touch, I felt guilty even thinking about it. Ethan's role in all this was more subtle, but no less irritating. He never congratulated me on the house, not once. When I invited them over for a casual dinner a month after moving in, he said, must be nice to blow that kind of money on a fancy starter pack. He meant the house. 2 beds, 2 baths, 1,300 square feet. I had refinished the floors myself, painted every wall, planted lavender in the yard. Starter pack, he said, like I was playing house. Still, I made excuses. That's what families do, right? When Mom asked if I could help with their property taxes that fall, I didn't hesitate. I'd had a good quarter at work. I sent over a check. When their water heater broke 2 months later, I covered half the bill. Don't worry, Dad said. You're investing in the family. That phrase stuck in my head, investing. I noticed things when I visited their place. Whispered conversations that stopped when I walked in. Ethan smirking at texts he didn't share. One evening, as I was about to leave, I overheard him say, she won't see it coming. When I walked in and asked what that meant, Dad said, we're planning your birthday surprise. There was no surprise. Riley, my best friend since freshman year of college, started noticing too. They're trying to reframe your house as theirs, she told me one day as we sipped overpriced coffee. You don't see it because you still want their approval. I scoffed. It's not like that. They're just traditional. Traditional doesn't mean entitled, she said. They act like you owe them something. Maybe she was right, but admitting that felt like a betrayal. So I pushed the thought down until the night Mom asked to review my homeowner's insurance just in case something happens. I handed it over without thinking and later realized I never got it back. She brushed it off and said she'd filed it for safekeeping. I never thought to question why. As when the pressure shifted from passive-aggressive to quietly invasive, they stopped asking questions and started giving instructions. You should move your desk to the other wall, Mom said one afternoon. It'll make space when guests stay over. You got us, Miss Al. Well, you never know. It's a family home now. I should have stopped her right then. But instead, I nodded and changed the subject, because challenging them felt dangerous in a way I couldn't quite explain. I didn't know I was already halfway evicted. The night everything collapsed didn't begin as a confrontation, it began as a celebration. I had just been promoted to senior financial consultant at my firm. The title came with a pay raise, a private office, and a long-coveted client portfolio. It was the culmination of years of grind, long hours, skipped vacations, and proving myself over and over again in a room full of people who rarely saw young women as leaders. I was proud. I wanted to share it. So I invited my family over for dinner. I planned every detail. I marinated the steaks the night before. Dad's favorite, I made garlic mashed potatoes with extra butter and roasted Brussels sprouts, just how Mom liked them. I even baked a lemon tart from scratch, which I hadn't done since my college days. Riley offered to come help, but I said no. I wanted this to be just me and them. I wanted them to see me not as the daughter who followed rules, but as a woman who had built a life and a home on her own terms. The doorbell rang at 5:00 p.m. sharp. I opened the door to see not just my parents, but Ethan too. He didn't have plans, Mom said with a shrug as they walked in. No, may we? No, congratulations. Just entitlement wrapped in politeness. Dinner was civil, barely. They complimented the food in generic ways. Ethan spent most of the evening scrolling his phone. Mom made passive comments about my choice of curtains and how I should have waited for the new models before buying my fridge. Dad inspected the crown molding like he was appraising a rental. Still, I smiled, I poured wine, I waited for the right moment to share my news. When dessert was served, I finally said, I wanted tonight to be special because I've been promoted, senior consultant. I tried to keep my voice steady and proud. There was a pause. Mom blinked. Dad raised an eyebrow. Ethan looked up just long enough to smirk. Well, Dad said eventually, that's good. More responsibilities? Yes, I nodded. More pay, more autonomy. I'll be building my own client list. Sounds exhausting, Mom said, slicing into the tart. I hope it's worth it. My heart sank. I'd hoped for joy, pride, maybe even a hug. What I got was a reminder that I was never meant to rise above the role they wrote for me. Still, I didn't see what was coming. Coffee was poured. We sat in the living room. That's when Dad's posture changed. Straight back, arms on his knees, serious, intentional. Aviary, he said, your mother and I have been thinking, this house, it's too much for one person. I frowned. What does that mean? It means, Mom cut in, this home should benefit the family. You wouldn't be here without us. Your success is part of our investment. I looked between them, stunned. I bought this house. I pay the mortgage. What are you talking about? It's time we make that official, Dad said. You'll move out. Ethan and your mother will move in. We're consolidating assets. I laughed. I actually laughed because the absurdity punched through my shock. You're not serious. But they were, deadly serious. Ethan leaned forward. I've already drawn up some renovation ideas. That wall between the kitchen and dining room, coming down. I'm not giving you my house, I said slowly. This is mine. You didn't help me pay for it. You ungrateful, Mom started. You gave me life, I said, standing now, but that doesn't mean you own mine. You'll leave your keys on the table, Dad said coldly. You have 1 week to pack your things. And I'll be supervising, Ethan added, arms folded. Make sure you don't take anything that belongs here. I looked around my living room, my couch, my bookshelf, the plants I kept alive for years. What belongs here is mine. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Dad snapped. We raised you. You owe us. No, I said. I owe myself peace, and you just destroyed that. Without another word, I placed my keys on the coffee table and walked out. Not because I agreed, but because I needed to get out before I broke down in front of them. Riley opened the door the second I arrived at her place. I collapsed into her arms, shaking. They stole my house, I whispered. And they didn't even flinch. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan measuring my kitchen, Mom wrapping family photos I didn't remember agreeing to hang, and Dad demanding my keys like I was a squatter in my own home. The next morning, I was nursing a cold cup of coffee on Riley's couch when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. "This is Avery," I said, voice hoarse. "Miss Monroe, this is Alex from Horizon Mortgage. I wanted to verify some recent activity on your account." My stomach dropped. "What kind of activity?" "Well," he hesitated. "Someone attempted to update the contact information and add 2 new co-borrowers to your mortgage yesterday afternoon." My heart slammed into my ribs. "Who?" "A Richard and Karen Monroe," he replied. "They had your full social security number. That's why the system flagged it for manual review. They tried to claim my house on paper while I was serving them dinner." I felt sick. "No," I said firmly, "I'm the only borrower. They have no legal right to access that account." "I thought so," Alex said. "We've locked it down, but you might want to follow up with legal counsel." I hung up and stared blankly at the wall. They weren't just trying to manipulate me emotionally, they were trying to erase me from my own life. That's when the truth finally landed. This wasn't just betrayal, it was war. I stayed on Riley's couch for the first 3 nights. She offered her bed, but I couldn't handle the softness, the warmth. It felt too much like comfort, and comfort made me cry. So I curled into the corner of her sectional, knees pulled tight to my chest, wrapped in a throw blanket I'd once given her for Christmas. Now it felt like the only familiar thing I had left. I didn't eat, I didn't shower, I barely moved. Every part of me was numb, except for the hollow ache in my chest that kept reminding me I'd lost something far deeper than property. I'd lost the illusion of safety, of love, of being seen. Riley tried to keep things normal. She brewed coffee every morning and played upbeat music. She texted me links to attorneys and left gentle post-it notes on the fridge. "You're not crazy. You didn't deserve this. Take your power back." But all I could hear were my father's words echoing in my head. "You owe us." It was like they'd planted a voice inside me years ago, and now that voice had taken over. "You should have seen this coming," it whispered. "You gave them access. You handed them the keys. You let them walk all over you for years." I wanted to scream at it, but part of me agreed. I called in sick the first day, then the second. On day 3, my manager left a voicemail saying she understood I was going through something personal, but they'd need documentation if I was going to extend my leave. Documentation? What would I even write? "Hi, I'm sorry I can't come to work today because my parents are trying to erase my existence and legally steal my house. Please advise." I turned off my phone. That night, I stood in Riley's bathroom, staring at myself in the mirror. I looked like someone who'd just crawled out of the wreckage, skin sallow, eyes rimmed red, hair greasy and unbrushed, and for the first time in my adult life, I said it out loud. I don't know who I am without them. It was terrifying, but it was also a start. The next morning, Riley handed me a mug of tea and said, "We're making a list." I blinked. "A list of what?" "Of what's still yours," she said, "and of what they can never touch again." She pulled out a notepad and wrote the first item, your name. That simple, that powerful. We sat at her kitchen table for over an hour, adding things slowly. My career, my integrity, my friends, my future, my voice, my story. I cried through most of it, but it felt like building a skeleton from the inside out. Later that afternoon, I finally called a lawyer. He listened patiently as I described everything, how they'd tried to add themselves to my mortgage, the pressure to hand over the house, the years of manipulation disguised as parenting. When I finished, he asked a single question: "Do you have anything in writing?" "No," I said, ashamed. "It was all verbal, emotional, implied." He sighed. "Well, that makes it harder, but not impossible. Let's start by securing your title, then we'll discuss a restraining order if needed." A restraining order against my parents. I thought that would make me feel like a monster. Instead, it felt like air. That night, I slept through the night for the first time in nearly a week. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was the beginning of separation from them, from their voices in my head, from the guilt they'd woven into my identity like a thread through a quilt. For the first time in my life, I was grieving not the loss of a family, but the illusion of one I never truly had. The next morning, I drove past my own house. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I just wanted to see it to remind myself it still stood, even if I couldn't be inside it yet. My lavender bushes were wilting from neglect. The porch light was still on in broad daylight. Ethan's truck was in the driveway. It looked like someone else's life now, someone careless. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and drove away, but not before whispering to myself, "You'll come home on your terms." That same day, I started therapy. Found a trauma-informed counselor who specialized in emotional abuse from family systems. I sat in her office and poured everything out. The guilt, the shame, the confusion, how I felt like a traitor for setting boundaries, how I missed them and hated them at the same time. She didn't flinch. She simply said, "What you're experiencing is grief, not for people who died, but for people who chose not to love you the way you needed." That broke something open in me, and for the first time since I'd left, I let myself feel everything. And I didn't apologize for any of it. It started with a copy of my deed. My lawyer, Mark, filed an emergency petition with the county recorder's office to freeze any changes to my property title. Just a precaution, he said, but the subtext was clear. If they tried to alter it again, there'd be legal consequences. The next step was changing every lock. Front door, back door, garage, even the side gate. I didn't go alone. Riley came with me, standing watch as the locksmith worked. I handed over the old key I'd once given my parents. "Toss it," I said. "Melt it. I never want to see it again." Then came the harder part, going inside. My hands shook as I opened the door to my own home. It felt like a crime scene. The air was stale. Furniture had been moved. My lavender plant was dead. The family photos Mom had brought over were now hung on the walls without frames, as if to stake a claim. I stood in the middle of the living room and whispered, "No more." Over the next few days, I documented everything. I took photos, recorded timestamps, and made notes of missing items. I discovered that they'd started forwarding some of my mail to their house. My voting registration had been rerouted. That crossed a line. I sent a cease and desist letter through Mark addressed to my parents and Ethan. It was formal, detailed, and signed in blue ink. "You are not to enter my home, alter my property, or claim any legal or financial interest in my residence. Any further attempts will be met with legal action." It felt cold, but it also felt good. That's when the backlash began. Mom called first, voicemail, her voice trembling like she was the victim. "I can't believe you'd turn on us this way after everything we've done. You're destroying this family." Then Ethan texted, "Wow, you've officially lost it. Don't worry, we'll survive without your drama." But Dad was the one who made it personal. He sent a typed letter in the mail, no return address, just a 3-page monologue about betrayal, duty, and how I'd always thought I was better than the rest of us. He ended it with, "You'll regret choosing strangers over blood." I read it once, then burned it. That night, Riley and I sat on my newly reclaimed couch eating pad thai and drinking cheap wine. "You're not choosing strangers," she said gently. "You're choosing peace." That became my mantra, but I wasn't done yet. Filed a police report for attempted mortgage fraud, not to press charges, just to create a paper trail. I changed all my passwords, closed the shared family cell phone account, and got a P.O. box. I scrubbed every trace of them from my financial records. And then I went nuclear. I filed a small claim suit against Ethan for the unpaid loan I'd given him 2 years ago. It wasn't much, just under $2,000, 0 cents, but it was symbolic. I submitted text messages, Venmo receipts, and a handwritten note he once left on my fridge. I'll pay you back next month, promise. He was served at work. According to a friend who still knew someone at his job, he threw a fit in the break room. It felt petty, but it also felt like justice. My lawyer handled most of the communication from that point forward. He received a vague threat from my dad's attorney suggesting we reconsider before this gets uglier. Mark just smiled and said, "Let them try." Meanwhile, I started repainting the house. It wasn't about aesthetics, it was about claiming space. I painted the living room a deep navy blue, bold, grounding. I replaced every light fixture. I donated the guest bed they once used and turned that room into a reading nook. Each change was a message. I'm not afraid of you anymore. I knew they watched from a distance. Ethan once drove by slowly while I was watering the lawn. Mom sent a blank birthday card, unsigned. Dad mailed a $5 0-cent bill tucked into a church bulletin, but I didn't respond. The silence was my final act of resistance. Healing didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, like sunlight through heavy curtains. I started cooking again, just for me. I resubscribed to the podcast I'd stopped listening to. I lit candles without worrying what anyone thought of the scent. One afternoon, I stood in my kitchen and made a cup of tea in total silence. No background noise, no footsteps, no tension, just stillness. It felt revolutionary. For the first time in my adult life, I had a life that was mine, and mine alone. Not borrowed, not managed, not shared out of obligation. I didn't win because I fought harder. I won because I finally stopped letting them define what love was supposed to look like. That was the real victory. It took longer than I expected to look back. Not just glance at the past, but really see it, see all the tiny cracks that had been there for years. I used to call them quirks. I used to say that's just how they are, but now I saw them for what they were, the roots of everything that eventually unraveled. I used to think we were a normal family, a little intense maybe, but nothing out of the ordinary. Every family has issues, right? But ours weren't just issues, they were strategies, systems, silent rules designed to keep me in my place. I remembered one Thanksgiving, I must have been 10, when I helped Mom make the entire meal, peeled potatoes until my hands were raw, basted the turkey, and even made the cranberry sauce from scratch. When the dinner was served, everyone complimented her. She smiled and said, "Well, Avery helped a little." I laughed at the time. It felt good to be needed. But now I realize that was the game. They'd let me participate just enough to feel included, never enough to be acknowledged. High school was a blur of doing too much and never quite enough. I got straight A's, joined clubs, and took care of Ethan when he got in trouble. I thought if I worked hard enough, they'd finally say they were proud of me. Instead, they said I was trying too hard. When I got into college on scholarship, they told the neighbors I was going to be a burden. "We'll see how long she lasts," Dad had joked at a barbecue. I laughed, too. I always laughed. Because I thought if I laughed, it wouldn't hurt as much. But it did. The deeper I went into therapy, the more patterns emerged. Every time I succeeded, they made it feel like a threat, like my growth was an insult to them. When I tried to share wins, they found ways to minimize them. When I set boundaries, they called me selfish. "You think you're better than us" became their favorite phrase. I heard it so often it started echoing in my own head. Even Ethan, my own brother, he had this way of diminishing everything I did. When I bought my first car, he called it a glorified toaster. When I moved into my apartment, he said, "Just wait until reality kicks in." And when I bought my house, the first thing he said was, "Bet it's lonely being single with that much space." They couldn't celebrate me, they could only compete with me. But the worst part, I let them. I let them into my home. I let them shape my self-worth. I believed that family meant loyalty at all costs, even the cost of myself. Looking back, I could trace every red flag, the way they dismissed my pain, the way they manipulated through guilt, the way mom weaponized silence when she didn't get her way, the way dad made jokes that were really punishments, and the way Ethan always acted like I owed him something just for existing. There's a kind of heartbreak that comes from realizing the people who were supposed to protect you were actually the ones you needed protection from. It makes you question everything. For weeks after the eviction, I kept asking myself, was any of it real? The Sunday pancakes, the birthday cards, the family game nights. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. Maybe the love was conditional all along, and I just didn't know the terms yet. My therapist helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't rare. They tied your worth to what you could do for them, she said. And when you stopped performing, they stopped loving. It wasn't about the house, it was about control. I'd taken up too much space. I'd stopped being the daughter who bent and broke for everyone else, and they couldn't stand that. So they tried to erase me. What they didn't know, what I hadn't known, was that losing their version of love would finally make space for something real. Self-love wasn't a bubble bath or a mantra on a mirror. It was waking up and not hearing their voices in my head. It was letting myself eat dinner alone and not feel empty. It was saying no without guilt. It was learning that love doesn't demand sacrifice, it creates safety. I wasn't just grieving my family. I was grieving the version of myself I built to survive them. The girl who laughed at every insult, the woman who paid every debt, the daughter who kept hoping this time would be different. She got me through, but she's not who I want to be anymore. And that's okay. Now, when I think about healing, I don't imagine some perfect, pain-free version of life. I imagine honesty. I imagine looking in the mirror and seeing someone I chose to become, not someone they molded out of guilt and obligation. I imagine building a life that's rooted in truth, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. Because of that kind of life, that's mine. Fully, completely, and finally mine. The day I realized I was free didn't come with fireworks, it came with a sink full of dishes. I'd just finished dinner, simple stir-fry, eaten barefoot on the couch while watching a show no one else would have liked. The credits rolled. I stood, walked to the kitchen, and turned on the faucet. As the warm water ran over my hands, I looked up and saw my reflection in the darkened window above the sink. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I didn't see failure, or a problem to fix, or a disappointment. I saw someone whole. That's when it hit me I'd done it. I'd cut ties, faced the storm, rebuilt from ash. And I hadn't just survived, I'd grown. The realization didn't make me cry, it made me smile. That weekend, I hosted friends for brunch. It was the first time I'd opened my doors since everything happened. I baked, decorated, and made playlists. I didn't clean obsessively or worry about judgment. I didn't try to prove anything. I just let people in on my terms. They brought flowers, stories, and wine. We laughed for hours. At one point, Riley pulled me aside and whispered, "You feel different, lighter." "I think I am," I said. Later that month, I took a solo trip up the coast, just me, my car, and a cabin near the cliffs. I brought books and snacks and didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, no itinerary, no plan to post about it, just time for myself. I watched sunsets wrapped in a blanket, hiked until my calves burned, and slept with the windows open. I felt small and safe and wild all at once. It was the first vacation I'd taken without asking permission. When I came home, the house didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt like mine. I started new rituals, morning walks, fresh flowers every Sunday. I left sticky notes on my mirror, not affirmations, but questions. What do you want today? Does this feel like truth? What if you're already enough? And slowly, joy came back. Not the explosive kind, the quiet kind, the kind that sneaks up on you while you're making coffee, folding laundry, or dancing in the kitchen to music only you love. Professionally, things shifted too. With the emotional weight lifted, I was sharper at work, more creative. I pitched new ideas and led bigger projects. My manager pulled me aside after one meeting and said, "You're different lately, focused, magnetic." I didn't tell her, well, some changes don't need explaining. Most surprisingly, I started reconnecting with myself and then with others, new friends, real conversations, people who didn't ask me to shrink. One afternoon, I got coffee with a colleague I used to avoid, Jordan, always kind, always perceptive. We talked for 2 hours. They didn't flinch when I mentioned boundaries or therapy or walking away from family. They just said that takes guts and grace. And in that moment, I felt both. I won't pretend everything was perfect. There were days when the guilt returned, holidays that felt empty, nights I missed the idea of family more than the reality. But I stopped apologizing for choosing peace. And somewhere along the way, peace stopped feeling like loneliness. It started feeling like freedom. One evening, I stood in my backyard under the porch light, staring up at the stars, the same sky I'd stared at as a kid, wishing for escape. Now, I didn't want to escape, I wanted to live. Not just function, not just survive the day. I wanted to fully inhabit the life I'd built on my terms, with my values, by my own strength. And for the first time, I believed I could. I wasn't just healing, I was becoming. Not who they wanted, not who I thought I had to be, but exactly who I was always meant to become. And that was more than enough. I exhaled and felt truly alive. Sometimes I still flinch when the phone rings. Even after all the progress, all the clarity, all the boundaries, I hear the buzz and wonder if it's them, if it's a message laced with guilt, if it's a voicemail full of silence, if it's another reminder that healing doesn't mean forgetting. But most days I don't pick up. I let it ring, I let it pass, and I go back to whatever I was doing, watering the plants, folding laundry, laughing with a friend, living. That's the word I keep coming back to, living. Not performing, not fixing, not pleasing, just being. I wish I could say there was a moment when everything felt complete, a final scene, a neat bow. But life isn't a movie. There are no credits rolling, no triumphant music, no narrator saying, "And that's how she reclaimed her life." There's just this. Mornings when the sun hits the floor in a way that feels like peace. Afternoons when I say no without a tremble in my voice. Evenings where I pour a glass of wine and don't feel the need to explain why. And there are still hard days. Days when I wonder if they think of me, if they regret anything, if they miss me at all. But I don't live in those questions anymore. I live in the answers I give myself. The manner is I matter even when no one's watching. The answer is I'm allowed to choose who gets access to me. The answer is that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's who shows up when everything else falls apart. And Riley did, and Jordan did, and I did. I showed up for myself. Maybe that's the part I'm proudest of, not the legal victories or the emotional clarity, but the fact that I didn't abandon myself when it would have been so easy to. I stayed, I built something new from the wreckage. And now when people ask about my family, I say, it's complicated, and then I smile because I'm okay with complicated. I don't need to shrink my story to make others comfortable. What happened to me was real, and what I've become because of it, also real and beautiful and still in progress. Because healing isn't linear, it's a spiral. You revisit the same memories and the same wounds, but from higher ground. You see more, you feel more, but you break less. That's how I know I've changed. A few weeks ago, I drove past the old coffee shop we used to visit on Sundays. I hadn't been there in years. I almost kept driving, but I didn't. Parked, I went inside, I ordered my drink the way I like it now, not the way they liked it then. I sat by the window and watched people come and go. No one looked at me, no one recognized me, and still I felt seen because I wasn't hiding anymore. And maybe that's the best kind of ending, not one where everything's perfect, but one where you no longer need perfection to feel at peace. I left that coffee shop with nothing but my keys and a quiet certainty in my chest. I had survived, I had grown, and I wasn't done. The road ahead wasn't mapped, but it was mine. And for the first time, that was enough to keep walking.